Are you an independent musician feeling overwhelmed by the endless act of juggling creativity, business, and self-care? You're not alone. That's why I created the Artist Mind Map. The Artist Mind Map is a free blueprint designed to help you get clear on the route you need to take to attain your career goals in alignment to your artistic values. This is not just another random PDF page for the forgotten corners of your hard disk. It's a timeless roadmap you can use for decades to come. Think of it as a go-to overview to consult. When you grab your free mind map, you get exclusive access to a masterclass that will take your career to the next level. I use the same methodologies and systems for my high-end paying clients and students. So why am I giving it to you for free? Simple. I want to build a community of artists who can count on each other for safe spaces. Music saved my life. I believe that you have all that it takes to be the artist you were meant to be, if you're willing to put in the work. And more importantly, understanding what that work is. And the Artist Mind Map was designed to help you do exactly that. So if this resonates with you, go to artistmindmap.com and download this resource. artistmindmap.com.
I'm in Bangkok, my winter base, my happy place, and I've been tired these past few weeks, quite tired. A feeling I usually don't associate with this city. It's not a very glamorous or special kind of tired, more like an ordinary, sometimes confusing, sometimes cellular, sometimes even muscular, physical tired. Like more of life is moving through my body than it's equipped to handle. And one of the parts that's especially confusing about all of this is this. This has been one of the most creatively alive periods I can remember. Some of my guests on my podcast have been stunning, mind-bending exchanges that stay with me way after the recording stops. I'm part of communities where the need to edit myself is ebbing. I am accepted, I even dare say loved, as my authentic, imperfect self. And most importantly, I'm deep inside making two very fulfilling records that feel like milestones on my artistic journey. This combination, though, has made something quite impossible to ignore. I'm exhausted. I'm exhausted, but not burned out. Let's discuss.
Welcome to another session solo cast. These solo casts were designed to help independent artists and musicians like you navigate the very complex labyrinth that is your artistic practice and career. They're based on empirical research and experiences of my own career as an independent musician and an educator and coach working with artists just like you. The primary aim behind these sessions is to offer accessibility to the kind of education many of us need to work with in order to forward ourselves in these very confusing times as empowered and independent artists in the truest sense of the word.
To start off with, let's clarify some basics here. I know this might be superfluous after that little intro I did, but I am tired, really tired. I couldn't keep sleeping forever. My workouts need a lot more care. My energy levels feel a little unreliable on some days. But here's the thing, I'm not out of ideas. I don't feel depleted, hopeless or empty. Nothing like what burnout is supposed to be. So I find myself asking this, what exactly is the difference? And more importantly, is there one in the first place? This little situation I find myself in has also got me to realize that us creatives, most of us have been taught to collapse these two states, exhaustion and burnout, into one quote-unquote diagnosis. My lived experience, though, after some 25 years of being a professional musician and educator for fellow creatives, suggests that a distinction might matter more than we think. Now, a little bit of context here. The last few years have not been my lightest. The demise of my father very suddenly, rearranging my internal architecture in ways that are still unfolding. A health scare with my mother, who I'm very close to. The sense of responsibility and vigilance these incidents have brought into the foreground are very palpable. And yet, throughout this entire phase, there's been sustained creative input on my part. Touring, finally last year, quite a lot of touring, a series of artist residencies that I did between Japan, Canary Islands, 2 different islands, Berlin, some multiple engagements in Europe. Recording, I'm working on 2 very relevant albums at the moment, as aforementioned. Writing, lots of writing, not just songs, but a lot of writing. Like my blog posts are close to 100 now. I think I have 148 podcast episodes out. Practicing, my musical practice, my piano practice has leveled up in a lot of ways I've wanted to for a while. And coaching. So as someone who helps creatives overcome, or better still prevent, burnout, I had to hold myself accountable to what's going on here. Was I deflecting, channeling stress into work, denying? Because I'm no stranger to what the dreaded burnout feels like. I've been there, which is why you can imagine my surprise at how this is not what that feels like, or that is not what this feels like. And that absence, for lack of a better term, caught my attention, not just personally, but professionally as well. Let's talk a little about what burnout actually points to. Burnout is usually, or often anyways, casually interpreted as tiredness taken too far. The research, though, is a bit more specific. Christina Maslach's work, for example, check her out sometime if you have a minute, Christina Maslach, frames burnout as a pattern involving emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, or cynicism, and a reduced sense of efficacy. In other words, it's not so much about low energy, though that can obviously be a very pertinent and natural byproduct, and possibly more about a rupture in meaning, agency, relational contact. In coaching and collaborative conversations, burnout will often show up linguistically before behaviorally. With a lot of collaborators and clients I work with, we could start talking about work as something quote-unquote happening to us rather than something we are choosing to do, which in my experience is a very risky space to occupy. Language now starts to flatten. Curiosity disappears. The sense of agency starts to disappear. Our role in the entire scenario starts becoming more and more difficult to actually put our finger on. The work may continue, but the presence, enthusiasm, intentionality, and even vibrancy may fluctuate. Now, to be clear, all of us in it for the long run are gonna have to deal with fluctuations of some sort. There's no perfect career, and certainly no perfect artistic practice. But that shift, the one I just described earlier on, really matters. Even more so when the fluctuations start spiraling downwards with a frequency and range that overstep the realm of a natural ebb and flow. Because here's the thing, exhaustion lives elsewhere. It has a different address. If I were to break it down to one specific factor distinguishing exhaustion and burnout, it would be this. Exhaustion is more honest. Why? It's usually easier to locate in the body. It shows up after long periods of physical and mental demand. Travel, grief, focus, responsibility, ambition, workload, heavy deadlines, things you should be familiar with as a touring artist or creative of any sort. The system is doing a lot, and it lets you know. The information on the quantities of tasks are easy to identify, even if overwhelming, and so your brain is a little less confused about the causes behind the way you feel. They're right there on your calendar or on your to-do list. Many other artists I work with, collaborators, clients, myself included, by the way, are surprised to notice how well oriented they can feel even after severe phases of prolonged artistic pressure. Heck, if any one of you have ever worked on full-length albums or like extended tour dates, art installations, or a painting you've been working on for months, you know what you signed up for. We care. We are engaged. We are engaged in the art, in the process. We recognize ourselves in what we're making when we are making art. And that's so deeply aligned with our sense of identity that despite the blood, sweat, and tears, it rarely feels like a state of failure per se when we're actually in the thick of it. Burnout, on the other hand, is insidious. It's exhaustion's sneakier twin. And here's the thing, it doesn't always announce itself via quote-unquote symptoms, plausible causes, or warning signs of any kind. The creative work and load and the role it plays in all of this. Let's talk a little about that. There's a part about creativity generally, especially from a professional standpoint, that rarely gets talked about. Creative work is expensive. It's not just the actual expenses, despite financial uncertainty, but the manner in which it asks for emotional availability and sustained attention despite an inherent brand of ambiguity that is normalized in the industry. Now add some real life to that, and tiredness becomes part of the terrain by default, which is not a deal breaker on its own. We knew that this wasn't the simplest path to walk when we started off on this journey. In fact, truth is, some of the most fertile creative periods I've witnessed both in my own life and the lives of collaborators and people I've worked with have actually coincided with physical or emotional strain. Exhaustion did come as part of the glory, not because strain in itself is desirable. In fact, spoiler alert, on the contrary, it can be damaging if habitual, but because meaning and authorship were still intact amidst the work. To reiterate, our identity didn't feel threatened. But in my experience, when creatives start to burn out, it's not the quantity of work that's the sole deciding factor. Burning out is not the if this equals then that. Listen to that again. Burning out is not the if this equals then that of prolonged hard work, which is a much more nuanced topic, hard work in itself, especially in the arts. Burnout is usually because we've been working wrong too long, out of alignment, felt conflicted about the work we're doing somewhere inside. Something vital went awry, or worse still, missing as the endeavor continued. Reading the signal correctly, for those of you who might have heard some of my early episodes, I put one out called Signal versus Noise Ratio. Consider checking that one out. Signal is roughly put, our inner voice, our inner authentic voice. And generally speaking, where things tend to go south in this whole burnout versus exhaustion discussion is when interpretations are a little off. 2 points here. Exhaustion misread as burnout leads to premature disengagement. Burnout misread as tiredness, on the other hand, leads to rest without curated repair. I just added the word curated repair because the kind of repair and rest we need in the case of a burnout needs to be a little more curated. Both, though, are followed by the same initial patterns repeating down the line. So when I coach folks who might be dealing with a sense of disillusionment and wondering if they're on the brink of a burnout, the inquiry I encourage is rarely about productivity or output. It's more about orientation. Productivity, output, these are the usual KPIs a lot of managerial and entrepreneurial jargon tends to hail as the holy grail of measurement, yeah, but artists work a little differently. So I will get my coaching clients to focus on orientation instead. Sometimes even collaborators I'm working on, even though, needless to say, I don't try to coach my collaborators per se, just on a side note. But some of the questions I'll try and throw at them are, do you still recognize yourself in the work you're doing? Does the effort still feel chosen by you? Has your relationship to meaning shifted? These are questions that point toward a very different kind of response, a more conscious acknowledgement of deeper conflict underneath what we think is happening to us. Think about that one. Now, at this point, I want to ask you this question. Between burnout and exhaustion, is there an actual physiological difference between these two states? I'm really glad you asked, even though I have no idea if you actually did. But I have been asking this question for a while now, and the answer is yes, very much so. And while fairly straightforward, it's imperative to know that it's more than a mere semantic we're talking about here. Okay, hear me out. Exhaustion can be a purely physical state. It's basically what happens when the body has worked hard for a sustained period of time. Think of an athlete after a race or a sport event. The body will be depleted, but not quote-unquote broken, assuming they've trained right. With enough rest, food, reduced workload following the event, all part of training, hopefully, the body knows how to recover. I'll look back upon some of the retreats I've done, yoga retreats, weekend yoga retreats, or jiu-jitsu retreats. I remember my body feeling so exhausted after it, but also so fresh, like detoxed. Like it was an incredibly energizing experience, as ironic as it sounds, as paradoxical as it sounds. My body was almost destroyed, especially this one jiu-jitsu retreat I did, a weekend one. I remember it took me almost a week to fully recover physically. Mentally though, psychologically though, I was on cloud nine. I felt so good. That's a very lived example of how exhaustion doesn't necessarily have to be a very dark or negative thing. It could actually be byproduct of a positive experience, which in my case was so. This is where burnout is very, very different, because burnout usually involves the nervous system being dysregulated. Prolonged and unresolved stress with an atrophied sense of choice, safety, or agency. Over time, that slips the body and even the mind into a low-grade survival state. Stress hormones stop regulating cleanly. Rest doesn't restore in the same way it should. Sleep suffers in quality and helps lesser. Burnout often carries elements of accumulated trauma. Sometimes not necessarily one big event per se, but repeated overwhelm, Repeated triggers without repair are solutions. Exhaustion will say, I've done a lot, and just keep it at that. Burnout, on the other hand, will say something like, I can't really keep going, but I'm not sure I feel safe enough to stop. Boom. That is a huge difference. Different needs, different responses. Exhaustion will usually respond well to recovery. A little containment, pacing, sleep, fewer moving parts for a while. Burnout asks for something a little more intricate. Structural changes. Self-inquiry, reflection, maybe some boundary renegotiations. Reconnection to inner values, authorship, identity. When the two are confused, burnout and exhaustion, we often end up either abandoning things we actually cared about or stay in conditions that we never really resonated with in the first place. And that, both of those situations, pretty much suck. Now, at this point, I'd like to take a minute to go into a little bit of detail with regards to why this matters to me. Yeah, here's the thing. I'm in a slightly unusual position. I'm a practicing artist, still inside the work, still navigating a lot of the tensions that the people I support and coach and teach are going through, which in my opinion is an ideal situation, but lots of opinions on that. Also, I spend a significant part of my week in conversation with creatives who are building or trying to build lives that don't extract from the nervous systems, from the general being, their presence. Over the years, that's taken the form of long-form coaching containers, one-on-one work, courses, an ongoing library of resources that I've been working on, podcasts, written pieces, lectures, workshops I do in person, apart from actually the music and the art that I work on behind the scenes or on stage. And the one thing I've noticed, despite all the productivity guru literature out there, and I've read a lot of it, mind you, at this point, is this. True creatives don't really give a shit about productivity. We're really interested in creativity. Duh. Now, it sounds banal when you say it. Of course, creatives are interested in creativity. But I think the point that often gets lost in the conversation is how so many of us end up collapsing creativity with productivity. The two are really not the same. Because here's the thing about creativity. It's a non-linear road. One where conditions can, in fact, be a little exhausting at times. But that's not burnout by default. And that difference is an essential one. Another personal note I'd like to add, in case I hadn't made it clear enough, I'm not saying that romanticizing an exhausting schedule or lack of structure in the latter, in the name of creativity, is something to glorify. Okay, let the record state this. That being said, over the years, something seems to have clarified itself quite clearly for me anyways at this point. I do not need less meaning. I need more recovery. So, more recovery, more meaning is what I'm looking for. And those are different conversations. So, if you find yourself in that somewhat liminal space where you might be feeling tired but engaged, enthusiastic, depleted and yet creatively present, consider this as an invite to be a little less harsh on yourself and not to catastrophize with quick conclusions. Life happens. and it can get tiring. And sometimes that's just a matter of capacity and nothing else. Capacity that may be asking for a little more attention rather than a complete overhaul. So if you're confused about the exact implications of the way you feel on one of those days, take a minute. Breathe. And ask yourself if it's too much work that's the real issue, or a lack of the kind you actually want to do. Hope that helps.
Hey folks, I hope you found that episode helpful. Here's a little request. If you did, consider sharing this episode with your folks. Think about the ways in which they might benefit the way you did. And please don't ever hesitate to reach out if you have queries. My name's TL. I'm an independent musician and educator and the founder of the Holistic Musician Academy.